Houston, Houston, do you copy? The tether, it's gone. I can see my hands in front of me, but I can't reach anything. Oh God, Earth is getting smaller. How is it getting smaller so fast? I have 17 hours of air left. 17 hours to think about this. Houston, please tell my wife. Tell her I can see the sunrise from here and it's the most beautiful thing I've ever. That was Commander Marcus Webb's final transmission, recorded 300 miles above Earth, 18 minutes before his radio went permanently silent. I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez, and for 12 years I was NASA's chief psychological evaluator for astronaut missions. What you just heard isn't from a movie or a simulation. It's from a classified incident that happened during EVA operations on the International Space Station, and it's one of 12 terrifying truths about space travel that they pray you'll never need to know. See, Marcus didn't die from equipment failure. He didn't suffocate from a torn suit or get struck by debris. His death was far worse than that. When his safety tether snapped during a routine spacewalk, he became subject to the cruelest law of physics imaginable, orbital mechanics. He began drifting away from the station at just 3 feet per second. That doesn't sound fast, does it? But in the vacuum of space, 3 feet per second might as well be light speed. After just 2 minutes, he was 60 meters away, completely beyond rescue range. His crewmates could only watch through the station's windows as he became a tiny speck against the star field, shrinking smaller and smaller until he disappeared forever into the infinite black. But here's what the official NASA report will never tell you. Marcus had 17 hours of life support remaining when his tether broke. 17 hours. He spent almost an entire day conscious, alert, and completely aware that every passing second carried him further from any possibility of rescue. For 17 hours he drifted through the void, watching Earth rotate peacefully below him, talking to Mission Control about his childhood, his dreams, his regrets, knowing with absolute certainty that he would die alone in the most hostile environment imaginable. The last thing he said before his radio finally went silent wasn't a cry for help or a message of despair. It was, "Earth is so beautiful from here. I wish everyone could see this." Then nothing. We never recovered his body. That's just the beginning. What I'm about to share with you comes from classified incident reports, psychological evaluations, and first-hand accounts that have been buried for decades. These aren't conspiracy theories or science fiction. These are documented cases of what really happens when human beings venture into an environment that was never meant to sustain life. I'm talking about astronauts who returned to Earth psychologically shattered, unable to reconnect with humanity because they had seen the ultimate perspective and realized how cosmically insignificant our entire existence really is. I'm talking about medical emergencies in deep space where help is literally 22 minutes away, and that 22-minute communication delay can mean the difference between life and an agonizing death. I'm talking about cosmic radiation that kills you slowly, invisibly, cell by cell, and you don't even know you're dying until months after you return to Earth. By the time this video ends, you'll understand why I resigned from NASA and why I can never look at the stars the same way again. You'll know about the astronaut who drowned in his own blood in zero gravity, about the crew that collectively hallucinated an extra team member for 14 months, about the solar storms that can kill you in minutes with no warning, and about the tiny grains of space debris traveling at 17,000 miles per hour that turn astronauts into floating corpses in the blink of an eye. You'll learn about the Kessler effect, a cascade of space debris that could trap humanity on Earth forever, surrounding our planet with a shell of high-speed shrapnel that makes space travel impossible for centuries. But most terrifying of all, you'll discover the 13th truth that I've never spoken about publicly until now, the psychological phenomenon that affects every single astronaut who returns from long-duration missions, a fundamental change in their perception of reality that our tests can't measure, but that I can see in their eyes. It's the look of someone who has stared into the infinite void and realized that space isn't just trying to kill them. It's showing them exactly how alone and insignificant humanity really is in the face of an indifferent universe. These 12 truths aren't just the hidden dangers of space exploration. They're proof that when humans venture beyond Earth's protective embrace, we're not discovering new worlds or expanding our horizons. We're trespassing in a realm of absolute hostility that breaks both body and mind in ways we're only beginning to understand. So, buckle up, because what you're about to hear will forever change how you think about space travel, and more importantly, it will make you grateful that you're safely trapped here on Earth by gravity's gentle embrace. Because after 12 years of debriefing astronauts who have returned from the void, I can tell you this with absolute certainty. Space doesn't want us there, and it has infinite ways to remind us that we don't belong. Terrifying truth. 1. The silent suffocation. Let me tell you about Gerald Pierce, a man who died for 4 minutes and 17 seconds while experiencing the most blissful joy of his entire life. Pierce was a mission specialist aboard Skylab 7, a decorated astronaut with 2 previous flights under his belt and a reputation for unshakable calm under pressure. That reputation meant nothing on March 15, 1974, when space decided to kill him in the most psychologically twisted way imaginable. What started as a routine maintenance day became a nightmare that still haunts NASA's classified medical files, because Pierce's near-death experience revealed something absolutely terrifying about how our brains respond to oxygen starvation in the vacuum of space. The incident began at 14:32 GMT when Pierce volunteered to check a minor atmospheric sensor malfunction in the station's secondary laboratory module. It should have been a 15-minute job. Swap out a faulty component, run a diagnostic, return to the main compartment. But unknown to anyone, including Pierce himself, a micrometeorite no larger than a grain of sand had punctured the module's hull 3 days earlier, creating a leak so small it was undetectable by standard monitoring systems. The hole was microscopic, barely wider than a human hair, but in the vacuum of space, even the tiniest breach becomes a slow-motion death sentence. As Pierce worked alone in the lab module, the station's atmosphere was being sucked out into space 1 molecule at a time, so gradually that the environmental alarms never triggered because the pressure drop was below their sensitivity threshold. What Pierce experienced next defies everything we think we know about suffocation and death. At first, he felt slightly lightheaded, which he attributed to the awkward position he was working in. Then came what he later described as a warm, tingling sensation that started in his fingertips and spread through his entire body. Instead of panic or distress, Pierce felt incredibly relaxed, almost dreamy. His audio logs from this period reveal a man gradually becoming more and more euphoric, his voice taking on an almost childlike wonder as he described colors becoming more vivid, and his work seeming incredibly easy and enjoyable. Mission control. His voice crackled through the comm system. I don't know what's different about the lighting in here today, but everything looks absolutely gorgeous. The equipment is practically glowing with these amazing blues and golds I've never seen before. What Pierce didn't realize was that his brain was being slowly starved of oxygen, and in response, it was flooding his system with endorphins, dopamine, and serotonin, essentially giving him the most powerful natural high a human being can experience. As oxygen levels in his blood dropped below critical thresholds, his brain began shutting down non-essential functions and triggering what neuroscientists call hypoxic euphoria. a state where impending death feels like the most profound spiritual experience imaginable. Pierce's condition deteriorated rapidly from that point, but his subjective experience became increasingly magical. He began talking to the equipment as if it were alive, thanking the circuit boards for their service and apologizing to the tools for having to manipulate them. His laughter became more frequent and more inappropriate, punctuated by long periods of what he called cosmic meditation, where he would float motionless, staring at the laboratory walls with the expression of absolute bliss on his face. Mission Control grew concerned when Pierce stopped responding to routine check-ins, but his vital signs appeared normal on their monitors because the changes happening in his brain weren't immediately reflected in his heart rate or blood pressure. The truly horrifying part of Pierce's experience began around the 30-minute mark, when his oxygen-starved brain started generating elaborate hallucinations that felt more real than reality itself. He began describing conversations with his deceased father, who had apparently materialized in the laboratory to help him with his work. Pierce's audio logs reveal him discussing complex engineering problems with this phantom figure, thanking his father for insights that were actually products of his dying brain's desperate attempt to make sense of its deteriorating condition. "Dad's here helping me calibrate the sensors," Pierce reported to Mission Control with genuine excitement in his voice. "He says the frequency modulation needs to be adjusted by 0.037 hertz. Dad always was better with electronics than me." What made this even more disturbing was that Pierce's hallucinatory father was giving him technically accurate information. His oxygen-starved brain was somehow accessing stored memories of his father's engineering knowledge and presenting it as a supernatural visitation. The line between life and death, between consciousness and dissolution, had become so blurred that Pierce was essentially receiving technical guidance from his own dying neurons. As his condition worsened, Pierce's hallucinations expanded beyond his father to include what he described as the most beautiful music I've ever heard, celestial harmonies that seemed to emanate from the station's hull itself. He began singing along with these phantom melodies, his voice taking on an otherworldly quality that sent chills down the spines of everyone in Mission Control. The songs weren't random. They were elaborately structured compositions that Pierce claimed were being taught to him by the voices in the walls. Later, analysis revealed that his brain was creating complex auditory hallucinations by misinterpreting the normal mechanical sounds of the space station, transforming the hum of ventilation systems and the creak of thermal expansion into what he perceived as angelic choirs. Pierce became so entranced by these hallucinatory concerts that he stopped working entirely, floating in the middle of the laboratory with his eyes closed and his arms spread wide, conducting an invisible orchestra while his blood oxygen levels plummeted toward fatal minimums. The crisis reached its peak when Pierce suddenly announced that he could see through the station's walls into space itself, and what he saw there was so beautiful that he needed to join it immediately. His crewmate, Thomas Kellner, had become increasingly worried about Pierce's strange behavior and lack of communication, so he made the decision to check on him personally. When Kellner opened the hatch to the laboratory module, he found Pierce floating unconscious with a beatific smile on his face and his skin taking on the blue tinge of severe oxygen deprivation. More terrifyingly, Pierce was slowly drifting toward the manual airlock controls, his unconscious body apparently still following through on his last conscious desire to join the beautiful darkness outside. Kellner had to physically restrain Pierce's unconscious form, while emergency procedures restored atmosphere to the compromised module. And even then, Pierce's vital signs remained dangerously unstable for several critical minutes. When Pierce finally regained consciousness after 4 minutes and 17 seconds of clinical death, his first words weren't relief or gratitude. They were desperate pleading to be allowed to return to the laboratory module. "You don't understand," he sobbed to the medical team. "It was the most beautiful thing I've ever experienced. My father was there, and the music was so perfect, and I could see the truth of everything. Please, I need to go back. I need to finish what we were doing." Pierce fought the medical restraints with surprising strength, begging his crewmates to let him return to what he now understood had been his own death. The psychological evaluation that followed revealed something that shook NASA's medical establishment to its core. Pierce genuinely believed that his near-death experience had been more real and meaningful than his entire previous life. He described the hallucinations with perfect clarity, and insisted that what he had experienced was not brain dysfunction but rather a glimpse into a higher reality that most humans never get to see. The most disturbing aspect of Pierce's case wasn't his physical recovery, which was complete within 72 hours, but the lasting psychological impact of having experienced euphoric dying. He became obsessed with returning to space, not for the adventure or scientific discovery, but because he was convinced that only in the oxygen-starved environment of that laboratory module could he reconnect with what he called the true nature of existence. Pierce began deliberately hyperventilating during training exercises, trying to recreate the hypoxic conditions that had produced his visions. He started avoiding oxygen-rich environments, claiming they made him feel disconnected from the universal consciousness he had touched during his near-death experience. His marriage ended when he became unable to relate to his wife's terrestrial concerns, and he began living alone, spending hours each day in meditation, trying to recapture the profound sense of cosmic unity he had felt while his brain was literally dying. The final tragedy of Gerald Pierce's story is that 6 months after his return to Earth, he was found dead in his apartment from what the coroner ruled accidental asphyxiation. Pierce had apparently been experimenting with breath-holding techniques and oxygen deprivation in an attempt to recreate his space station experience. His final journal entry, found beside his body, read, "I've spent every day since Skylab trying to find my way back to that place where everything made perfect sense. I know now that the only way back is forward. Dad is waiting for me and the music is calling. This isn't death. This is coming home." What makes Pierce's case so absolutely terrifying isn't just that oxygen deprivation can kill you. It's that it can make death feel so transcendently beautiful that part of you never wants to come back from the edge of oblivion. Space doesn't just threaten your life. It threatens your very desire to live by showing your dying brain a glimpse of something so perfect that reality itself becomes unbearable by comparison. Terrifying truth. 2. Blood in zero gravity. Let me tell you about Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a mission specialist who discovered that in zero gravity, your own blood can become your executioner. Walsh was conducting what should have been a routine EVA repair on the International Space Station's solar array assembly, when she experienced something that fundamentally changed how NASA thinks about medical emergencies in space. It was February 14, 1997, and Walsh was 40 minutes into what was supposed to be a simple 3-hour spacewalk to replace a malfunctioning thermal control unit. She was working alone outside the station while her crewmate monitored from inside, following standard protocol for minor repairs. Everything was going perfectly until Walsh's glove caught on a sharp edge of the damaged thermal unit, creating what appeared to be a tiny puncture in the outer layer of her suit. The breach was so small that her suit's pressure sensors didn't even register it as a leak, but it was large enough to allow a small metal fragment to penetrate through to her hand, creating what would normally be considered a minor cut, barely deep enough to require a bandage on Earth. But this wasn't Earth, and what happened next revealed one of the most horrifying truths about human physiology in the vacuum of space. In Earth's gravity, when you get cut, blood flows downward and away from the wound, eventually clotting and sealing the injury. In zero gravity, blood doesn't flow anywhere. It forms perfect spheres that float freely, governed only by surface tension and the slightest air currents. Walsh's first indication that something was wrong came when she noticed what she initially thought were tiny red marbles floating around inside her helmet. "Houston, I'm seeing some kind of debris in my visor area," she reported calmly, not yet realizing that the debris was her own blood forming perfect spherical droplets that were now floating freely in the confined space of her helmet. As more blood seeped from the small puncture wound on her hand, it traveled up her arm inside the suit, emerged from her glove into the helmet area, and began forming larger and larger spheres that floated directly in front of her face. The situation deteriorated rapidly as Walsh realized what she was seeing. "Houston, I think I'm bleeding inside my helmet," her voice now carrying the first edge of panic. "There are blood droplets floating in front of my visor and they're getting bigger." But the nightmare was just beginning, because blood in zero gravity doesn't behave like any liquid terrestrial medicine has ever had to deal with. The spheres began coalescing, forming larger and larger globules that started adhering to the inside of her helmet's visor through surface tension. Unlike drops of water, which might disperse or splash, blood's protein content and viscosity made it stick tenaciously to any surface it contacted. Within minutes, Walsh's field of vision was partially obscured by a growing red film that spread across her visor like a living thing, fed by the continuous seepage from her wounded hand. More terrifyingly, the smaller droplets that hadn't yet adhered to the visor were floating freely around her head, and with each breath and slight movement, some of these microscopic spheres were being drawn into her nose and mouth. What happened next pushed Walsh into a nightmare that medical textbooks had never considered possible. She began inhaling her own blood. Not the dramatic choking and gasping you might expect from terrestrial bleeding, but the insidious process where tiny blood droplets were being pulled into her respiratory system with each breath. "I can taste blood in my mouth," Walsh reported, her voice now clearly strained. "It's not dripping down like normal bleeding. It's floating around in here and I'm breathing it in." The medical team on Earth was helpless to provide guidance because no one had ever studied the effects of inhaling dispersed blood in a zero-gravity environment. Walsh was essentially drowning in slow motion, her lungs gradually filling with her own blood, one microscopic droplet at a time, while simultaneously losing her ability to see through the spreading crimson film on her visor. The psychological horror of Walsh's situation became apparent in her increasingly desperate communications with Mission Control. She described feeling like she was trapped inside a snow globe filled with her own blood, unable to wipe away the spheres that kept floating back into her breathing space no matter how she moved her head. "The blood isn't flowing away like it should," she explained through increasingly labored breathing. "It just stays here, floating around my face, and every time I exhale it spreads out more, and when I inhale I'm pulling it into my lungs. I can feel it in my chest, Houston. I can feel myself drowning in my own blood." The most terrifying aspect was that the bleeding itself wasn't life-threatening. The puncture wound was minor and would have sealed itself within minutes on Earth. But in zero gravity, that small amount of blood became a persistent, inescapable threat that transformed her helmet into a death trap. Mission Control made the decision to abort the EVA immediately, but Walsh's return to the airlock became a race against time as her breathing became more labored and her vision more obscured. She had to navigate back to the station essentially blind, guided only by voice commands from her crewmate, while fighting the growing panic of feeling her lungs filling with blood. The journey that should have taken 10 minutes stretched to 25, as Walsh struggled with disorientation caused by blood loss, oxygen displacement in her lungs, and the psychological trauma of being trapped in what she described as a floating red nightmare. When she finally reached the airlock, her crewmate, Tom Rodriguez, could see through the helmet's external visor that Walsh's face was barely visible behind a mask of her own blood, and she was clearly struggling to breathe. The repressurization and helmet removal process revealed the full horror of what Walsh had endured. The inside of her helmet looked like a crime scene, coated with blood that had spread and adhered in patterns impossible to achieve in Earth's gravity. Walsh herself was semi-conscious, her lungs partially filled with blood that had been inhaled over the course of the EVA. Most disturbingly, medical examination revealed that she had aspirated far more blood than should have been possible from such a small wound, because the zero-gravity environment had allowed every drop to remain airborne and available for inhalation instead of flowing away from her breathing space. Dr. Rodriguez later described the helmet's interior as looking like the inside of someone's chest cavity after a hemorrhage, with blood coating every surface in a way that seemed to defy physics. Walsh's recovery took weeks, not because of blood loss, but because of the lung damage caused by inhaling dispersed blood over an extended period. The blood in her lungs had begun to coagulate, creating blockages that required aggressive medical intervention to clear. More traumatically, Walsh developed severe claustrophobia and panic attacks whenever she was enclosed in small spaces, because the memory of being trapped in a blood-filled helmet had fundamentally altered her perception of confined environments. She described recurring nightmares where she was floating in space surrounded by spheres of her own blood, unable to escape the floating red globules no matter which direction she moved. On Earth, when you bleed, the blood goes away, Walsh explained during her psychological evaluation. In space, it stays with you. It surrounds you. It becomes part of the environment you are trapped in, and there's no escape from your own body's attempt to kill you. The most chilling aspect of Walsh's case was the classified addendum to her medical report, which documented a phenomenon that NASA had never encountered before. During her time in the blood-filled helmet, Walsh had experienced what she described as blood hallucinations, visual distortions caused by looking through the floating spheres of her own blood. She reported seeing faces in the blood patterns, geometric shapes that seemed to move independently, and, most disturbingly, what she called memories playing in the blood droplets, childhood scenes and deceased relatives that appeared to be somehow contained within the floating spheres. Medical experts theorized that the combination of oxygen deprivation, psychological trauma, and the unique visual properties of blood in zero gravity had created a hallucinatory state unlike anything previously documented. Walsh insisted that these weren't hallucinations but rather some kind of supernatural communication, claiming that her blood in zero gravity had become a medium through which she could see the other side of existence. The final horror of Jennifer Walsh's story is that she never flew in space again, not because NASA deemed her unfit, but because she became convinced that her blood had been permanently altered by its time in zero gravity. She developed what psychiatrists called hemophobic paranoia, becoming obsessed with the idea that her blood now contained space memories that made her dangerous to be around. Walsh began avoiding medical procedures, refusing blood tests, and eventually isolating herself completely, convinced that her blood had become somehow alien and threatening to others. She spent her final years writing detailed journals about her experience, describing how she could still feel the blood floating around her head whenever she closed her eyes, and how she sometimes woke up gasping, convinced she was still trapped in that crimson-filled helmet, slowly drowning in her own life force while floating helplessly in the infinite black of space. Walsh's case proved that in zero gravity, even your own blood becomes an enemy, transforming from the fluid of life into floating spheres of death that can blind you, suffocate you, and ultimately drive you mad with the realization that your body's most essential substance can become the instrument of your own destruction. Terrifying truth. 3. The unstoppable drift. Let me tell you the complete story of Commander Marcus Webb, the man whose death you heard at the beginning of this nightmare, because what really happened during those 18 minutes before his radio went silent is far more horrifying than any fiction could ever be. Webb was a veteran astronaut with 4 successful missions under his belt, a man known for his calm under pressure and his almost supernatural to solve problems in crisis situations. That reputation meant nothing on October 7, 2019, when he became the first human being to experience the most psychologically devastating way to die in space: the unstoppable drift. Webb was 43 minutes into what should have been a routine EVA to replace a malfunctioning communications array on the exterior of the International Space Station. He was working alongside his partner, Dr. Sarah Chen, when disaster struck in the most innocuous way imaginable. Webb's primary safety tether, a titanium steel cable rated to withstand forces far beyond anything expected during normal EVA operations, had been compromised by a microscopic stress fracture caused by repeated thermal cycling over months of space exposure. The break happened without warning, without drama, without any of the explosive violence you might expect from such a catastrophic failure. Webb simply felt a gentle tug as he reached for a replacement component, and then he was floating free, no longer connected to the station by anything but the rapidly increasing distance between his body and safety. "Sarah, I think my tether just broke." Webb's voice came through the comm system with the kind of professional calm that only astronauts possess in the face of mortal danger. But even as he spoke those words, Webb was already subject to the cruelest law of orbital mechanics, Newton's first law of motion. An object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an external force, and in the vacuum of space, there are no external forces to slow down a drifting human being. Webb was moving away from the ISS at approximately 3 feet per second, a speed that sounds almost leisurely until you realize that in space, there's no air resistance, no friction, no way to slow down or change direction without a propulsion system. What followed was 18 minutes of the most psychologically devastating death ever recorded in human spaceflight history, because Webb remained conscious, coherent, and completely aware of his situation for every single second of his drift into the infinite void. "I'm at about 10 meters now," Webb reported with professional precision, his voice still steady as he watched the ISS slowly shrinking in his field of vision. "The drift rate appears constant at approximately 0.9 meters per second. Sarah, can you see me from your position?" Dr. Chen's anguished response came through clearly. "I can see you, Marcus, but you're already too far for the emergency tether. We're working on a solution." But there was no solution, and everyone on the comm channel knew it. Webb was beyond the reach of any rescue equipment, drifting away at a rate that put him farther from safety with each passing moment. The terrible mathematics of his situation were simple and inexorable. After just 2 minutes, he was over 60 meters away, well beyond the range of any emergency procedures or rescue equipment. The psychological horror of Webb's situation became apparent as he continued his professional reporting while simultaneously processing the absolute certainty of his own death. Distance, now approximately 100 meters and increasing. Webb's voice maintained its steady cadence, but you could hear the first tremor of existential terror creeping in. "I have 17 hours and 23 minutes of life support remaining. Mission Control, I need you to contact my wife immediately and tell her—" His voice broke slightly, and for the first time, the full weight of his situation seemed to hit him. Webb wasn't going to die quickly from system failure or catastrophic decompression. He was going to spend nearly an entire day floating conscious in the void, watching Earth rotate peacefully below him while he drifted further and further from any possibility of human contact or rescue. The psychological impact of knowing you have 17 hours to contemplate your own death while floating helplessly in the most hostile environment imaginable is something no human mind was designed to process. As Webb drifted beyond visual range of the ISS, his communications took on an increasingly surreal quality as he struggled to maintain his professional composure while facing the ultimate existential crisis. Distance now estimated at 500 meters, his voice had become smaller, more distant, tinged with the growing realization that he was truly alone, in a way no human being had ever been alone before. Earth looks incredibly beautiful from this perspective. The sunrise is happening over the Pacific right now, and the colors they're indescribable. I wish everyone could see this. Webb had entered what psychologists call terminal acceptance, a state where the mind, faced with inescapable death, begins to find meaning and beauty in the experience as a psychological defense mechanism. But underneath that forced tranquility, you could hear something breaking in his voice as the full scope of his isolation became clear. He was drifting through the infinite vacuum at nearly 4 miles per hour, getting farther from Earth with every passing second, and there was absolutely nothing anyone could do to help him. The most heartbreaking aspect of Webb's final transmission came as he began talking directly to his family, knowing that his words were being recorded and would eventually reach them. "Tell Emma that Daddy is seeing the most beautiful sunset from up here, and that I'm thinking about her bedtime stories. Tell her that the stars look like the glitter she puts on her drawings, and that I can see our house from here even though I know that's impossible." Webb's professional facade was crumbling as the psychological weight of leaving behind a 5-year-old daughter began to override his astronaut training. "Tell my wife, Sarah, that I love her more than all the stars I can see from here, and that I'm not scared because this is the most peaceful place I've ever been. Tell her the sunrise looks just like her hair when she's sleeping, and that I'll be watching over both of them from up here." The tragedy in Webb's words wasn't just the obvious grief of a dying father, but the way he was trying to transform his horrific death into something beautiful for his family, creating poetic meaning from what was essentially the most terrifying way any human being has ever died. Webb's final minutes revealed the ultimate psychological horror of death by drift, the way the human mind processes the transition from life to eternal isolation. "I can't see the station anymore." His voice had become dreamy, distant, almost meditative. "Earth is getting smaller, but it's still the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I'm rotating slowly, so I can see all the stars now. There are so many more than you can see from Earth. I never realized how many there were." Webb was experiencing what psychologists call cosmic perspective anxiety, the overwhelming realization of human insignificance when faced with the true scale of the universe. But rather than terror, his isolation was producing a strange kind of transcendent calm, as if his mind was protecting itself from madness by finding spiritual meaning in his cosmic abandonment. "I can see the whole solar system from here," Webb continued, though orbital mechanics made this impossible. "It's all so perfectly arranged, like someone designed it to be beautiful. I think I understand something now that I never understood before." The final transmission from Commander Marcus Webb came 17 hours and 42 minutes after his tether broke, long after he should have been dead from life support failure, suggesting that his final words were either transmitted with his last breath or recorded on his suit's emergency system to be broadcast posthumously. "I wanted to tell everyone that dying in space isn't scary like we thought it would be. It's peaceful. It's like becoming part of something bigger than yourself. The Earth looks like a tiny blue marble now, so small and perfect and fragile. I can see why astronauts come back changed. Up here, you realize that all our problems and fears and conflicts are happening on this little speck of dust floating in infinite space. And somehow that makes everything seem both more precious and more pointless at the same time. I hope they find a way to bring more people up here someday, because everyone should see how beautiful and alone we really are. Then silence. Webb's body was never recovered, and, according to orbital calculations, he's still out there, drifting through the solar system, a permanent monument to humanity's fragility in the face of infinite space. The most terrifying truth about Webb's death isn't that space killed him. It's that space gave him 17 hours to contemplate the ultimate nature of human isolation and cosmic insignificance, and somehow, impossibly, he found peace in that contemplation, leaving behind a final message that was equal parts beautiful and absolutely horrifying in its acceptance of eternal loneliness. Terrifying truth. 4. Decompression, Delusion. Let me tell you about Dr. Amanda Chen, a woman who experienced death by vacuum and lived to describe it, and whose testimony revealed that explosive decompression isn't the quick death Hollywood shows us. It's 15 seconds of the most alien terror the human mind can comprehend. Chen was a biomechanical engineer and former Navy pilot who volunteered for NASA's most classified and dangerous training program, the Rapid Decompression Survival Protocol, designed to prepare astronauts for catastrophic hull breaches during deep space missions. The program involved exposing test subjects to controlled vacuum conditions in a specialized chamber, simulating the exact conditions an astronaut would face if their spacecraft suddenly lost pressure in the void of space. Chen had undergone months of psychological preparation and medical conditioning, convinced she was ready for anything the training could throw at her. She was wrong. On March the 23rd, 2002, Chen entered the decompression chamber for what was supposed to be a 30-second exposure to near vacuum conditions, fully aware that she would be rescued quickly and that her life was never truly in danger. That knowledge meant nothing when the chamber pressure dropped to 1% of Earth normal, and her body began responding to an environment no human being was ever meant to survive. The first thing Chen experienced wasn't pain or panic, but something far more disturbing, the sensation of her body betraying her in ways she never could have imagined. The moment the pressure dropped, I felt my saliva start to bubble and foam on my tongue, Chen described in her classified debriefing. It wasn't painful, but it was so alien, so completely wrong, that my brain couldn't process what was happening. I knew intellectually what to expect, but feeling your own spit boiling in your mouth while you're still conscious is like having your body become foreign to you. The moisture in her mouth, throat, and nasal passages began to vaporize immediately, creating a foam that filled her oral cavity and made it impossible to swallow or speak. But the psychological horror wasn't the physical sensation. It was the realization that her body was transforming into something that didn't belong to her anymore. Chen described feeling like she was watching someone else's body react to impossible conditions, while her consciousness remained trapped inside, helpless to control the alien processes taking over her physiology. What happened next pushed Chen into a state of existential terror that she still struggles to articulate decades later. As the dissolved gases in her bloodstream began to form bubbles, her skin started to swell in a process called ebulism, making her feel like she was inflating from the inside out. I could feel my skin stretching and expanding like a balloon being filled with air. But from the inside, Chen explained, my arms and legs became puffy and distorted, and I could see my hands swelling up like rubber gloves being inflated. But the worst part wasn't the physical sensation. It was looking down at my own body and not recognizing it as human anymore. I looked like some kind of alien creature, all bloated and distorted, and my brain kept screaming that this couldn't be my body, that I had somehow been transported into something else's flesh. The psychological impact of watching your own form become unrecognizable while you remain conscious is something no amount of training can prepare you for, because it attacks the most fundamental aspect of human identity, the connection between mind and body. Chen's description of the next phase of her decompression experience reveals why vacuum exposure is so psychologically devastating. As the pressure in her lungs equalized with the chamber's near vacuum, she felt what she described as drowning in reverse. Instead of liquid entering her lungs, everything was being pulled out of them. You know how drowning feels like fluid filling up your chest cavity? Decompression feels like everything inside your chest is being sucked out through your mouth and nose. It's not like holding your breath. It's like something invisible is pulling the air out of you, and you can feel your lungs collapsing and expanding in ways they were never meant to move. I could feel the gas bubbles forming in my bloodstream, like tiny fizzing sensations under my skin, and I knew that my blood was literally boiling inside my veins. The combination of ebulism, lung expansion, and the sensation of internal boiling created what Chen called body horror beyond description. The experience of feeling your own physiology become utterly alien while your consciousness remained perfectly clear and aware of every impossible sensation. The most terrifying aspect of Chen's experience was how her brain responded to 15 seconds that felt like hours of impossible physical sensations. Time dilated in the most horrible way, she explained during her psychological evaluation. I knew the exposure was supposed to last 30 seconds, but those first 15 seconds of consciousness felt like they went on forever. My brain was trying to process sensations that don't exist in normal human experience, and it started creating explanations that were worse than the reality. I became convinced that I was being transformed into something non-human, that the vacuum was changing my DNA, that I would never be able to return to normal human physiology. I remember thinking that this must be what it feels like to become an alien, to have your humanity stripped away one molecule at a time. Chen's mind, faced with sensations no human had ever evolved to handle, began generating paranoid delusions about permanent transformation, cosmic punishment, and loss of species identity that persisted long after her rescue and medical treatment. When Chen lost consciousness after 15 seconds, her body continued to undergo changes that would haunt her dreams for years afterward. Medical monitoring showed that her skin had swollen to nearly twice its normal thickness. Her heart had enlarged significantly as it struggled to pump bubble-filled blood, and her body temperature had dropped rapidly as heat radiated away into the vacuum. But the most disturbing discovery came when she regained consciousness after repressurization. Chen had no memory of losing consciousness, and from her perspective she had experienced the entire 30-second exposure while awake and aware. I remember every second of those 30 seconds, she insisted, despite medical evidence that she had been unconscious for the final 15. I remember floating in the darkness, feeling my body continuing to change, becoming more and more alien until I wasn't sure if I was still human or if I had become something else entirely. I remember seeing lights that couldn't have been there, hearing voices that spoke in mathematics instead of words, feeling like I was being judged by the vacuum itself. Chen's post-decompression psychological evaluation revealed trauma symptoms unlike anything previously documented in aerospace medicine. She developed what psychiatrists called vacuum paranoia, an irrational fear that the air around her was constantly on the verge of disappearing, leaving her trapped again in that alien state between life and death. I can't be in small rooms anymore because I'm always afraid the air will suddenly get sucked out, Chen explained. I wake up at night feeling like my saliva is starting to bubble, and I have to run outside to convince myself that there's still atmosphere around me. But the worst part is that sometimes I miss it. Sometimes I remember how peaceful it felt when my body wasn't human anymore, when I was floating in that space between existence and non-existence. Part of me wants to go back to that place, and that terrifies me more than the decompression itself. Chen never flew in space, not because NASA deemed her unfit, but because she became convinced that her 15 seconds in the vacuum had permanently altered her on a molecular level, making her incompatible with the normal human existence. The final horror of Amanda Chen's story is contained in her classified medical files, which document physical changes that persisted long after her decompression experience. Chen continued to experience periodic episodes of what she called phantom embolism, the sensation that her skin was swelling and her blood was bubbling, even in normal atmospheric conditions. She reported seeing vacuum memories, visual hallucinations of the lights and mathematical voices she remembered from her unconscious period, as if her brief exposure to the void had left permanent imprints on her perception of reality. Most disturbing of all, Chen developed an obsession with returning to vacuum conditions, not for scientific purposes but because she believed that her 15 seconds of near death had shown her the true nature of existence beyond the illusion of atmosphere and gravity. Chen spent her remaining years writing detailed journals about her experience, describing how those 15 seconds in the vacuum had convinced her that normal human life was a kind of sensory prison, and that only in the alien environment of space could consciousness experience its true form. Her final journal entry, found after her death from what appeared to be intentional asphyxiation, read, "I've spent 20 years trying to get back to those 15 seconds when my body became something more than human. I know now that the only way back is to stop fighting the vacuum that's calling me home." Chen's case proved that decompression doesn't just threaten your life, it threatens your fundamental sense of human identity, showing you a version of existence so alien and terrifying that some part of your mind never stops trying to return to that impossible state between life and death. Terrifying truth. 5. Space Madness Protocol. Let me tell you about Commander Sarah Blackwood, a woman who spent 14 months creating an imaginary crewmate so convincing that 4 highly trained astronauts collectively lost their grip on reality and still send Christmas cards to a person who never existed. Blackwood was the mission commander for Mars Simulation 447, the most ambitious, long-duration isolation study ever conducted, designed to replicate the psychological conditions of an actual Mars mission. The simulation took place in a sealed habitat module in the Nevada desert, where 6 astronauts would live in complete isolation for 14 months, following the exact protocols they would use on a real Mars mission. Blackwood was chosen as commander because of her exceptional psychological stability, her ability to maintain team cohesion under stress, and her perfect score on every psychological evaluation NASA had ever administered. Those qualifications meant nothing when the human mind, faced with impossible isolation and stress, began creating its own reality to cope with conditions no evolutionary psychology had prepared it to handle. The first sign that something was wrong came during month 4 of the simulation, when Blackwood began referring to someone named David during routine mission reports. Initially, her crewmates assumed she was talking about David Chen, the mission's flight engineer, but Chen was present during these conversations and wasn't responding to Blackwood's comments. When questioned, Blackwood looked genuinely confused and insisted that David was their atmospheric systems specialist who had been with them since the beginning of the mission. "David's running the atmospheric readings this morning," Blackwood would announce during daily briefings, setting aside data sheets for someone who wasn't there. He's very thorough with the calibrations, always double-checks everything. Her crewmates initially dismissed this as stress-induced confusion, perhaps mixing up names or remembering someone from training, but Blackwood's references to David became more frequent and more detailed, creating an elaborate backstory for a person who had never existed. What made Blackwood's hallucination so psychologically devastating was how perfectly David filled the gaps in their mission capabilities that were causing the crew the most stress. The simulation was deliberately understaffed to test how astronauts would handle impossible workloads during a real Mars mission, and the atmospheric systems were the most complex and time-consuming aspect of their daily operations. David, according to Blackwood, was a specialist who could handle these systems more efficiently than anyone else, freeing up the real crew members to focus on other critical tasks. David says the CO2 scrubbers are running at 97% efficiency. Blackwood would report with complete confidence, despite the fact that none of the other crew members had checked the scrubbers that day. Disturbingly, when they did check, David's readings were always accurate. Blackwood's hallucination wasn't random. Her stressed mind was creating a competent, helpful team member who could solve their most pressing problems, and somehow her subconscious was processing real system data and attributing it to her imaginary colleague. The situation escalated beyond simple hallucination when the other crew members began experiencing what psychologists call shared psychotic disorder. They started playing along with Blackwood's delusion, not because they believed David existed, but because acknowledging his presence made their impossible workload seem more manageable. Flight engineer Maria Santos began setting a place for David at meals, reasoning that it helped maintain Blackwood's psychological stability. Mission specialist Dr. James Park started having conversations with David about technical problems, finding that talking through issues with Blackwood's imaginary expert helped him think more clearly. It started as humor, Santos explained during post-mission debriefing. We'd make jokes about David being invisible or working in another module, but gradually it became easier to just go along with it. When Sarah would say, "David thinks we should recalibrate the water recycler," we'd just do it, because her David suggestions were usually good ideas. It was less stressful than constantly correcting her delusion. By month 8, all 6 crew members were actively participating in the David delusion, creating the most documented case of mass hysteria in space psychology history. They were having group meetings that included David as a participant, assigning him specific duties, and even creating work schedules that accounted for his contributions to daily operations. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the mission psychologist, began keeping detailed notes about David's personality based on the crew's descriptions. He was quiet, methodical, had a dry sense of humor, and preferred working night shifts when the habitat was quieter. The crew developed elaborate explanations for why David was never visible to outside observers. He was camera-shy, preferred to work in the equipment bays, was always in whichever module the cameras weren't monitoring. "We created an entire life history for someone who didn't exist," Rodriguez later admitted. "We knew David wasn't real on some level, but we had invested so much emotional energy in maintaining the illusion that admitting he was imaginary felt like losing a real team member." The psychological horror of the David delusion reached its peak when the crew began experiencing genuine grief about David's departure as the simulation neared its end. Blackwood became increasingly anxious about leaving David behind in the habitat, worried that he wouldn't be able to handle the isolation after the rest of the crew returned to Earth. "David's been with us for over a year," she explained to mission controllers with genuine tears in her eyes. "He's a part of our family now. How can we just abandon him here? He's done so much for this mission, and now we're going to leave him alone in this place forever." The other crew members shared her distress, discussing ways to help David transition after their departure, and even suggesting that he be included in the post-mission celebration events. Mission psychologists were faced with the unprecedented situation of having to provide grief counseling for the loss of an imaginary person who had become psychologically real to 6 highly trained, previously stable individuals. The most disturbing aspect of the David phenomenon became apparent during the crew's post-mission psychological evaluations, when it became clear that their shared delusion had created genuine memories of interactions with a person who had never existed. The crew could describe David's physical appearance in perfect detail: tall, thin, dark hair, quiet voice, slight limp from a childhood injury. They remembered conversations with him about his family, his fears about the mission, his homesickness for Earth. They had formed genuine emotional bonds with their collective hallucination, and the process of accepting that these memories were false created a form of identity crisis that none of them fully recovered from. "I have clear memories of David helping me repair the water recycler, Doctor," Park insisted during his evaluation. "I can remember his voice, his suggestions, the way he handed me tools. If those memories aren't real, how can I trust any of my memories? How do I know which parts of the mission actually happened and which parts were just elaborate group fantasies?" The final horror of the David delusion lies in its persistence long after the simulation ended. Despite intensive psychological therapy and clear evidence that David never existed, several crew members continued to believe in his reality at some level. Commander Blackwood still maintains a social media account for David, posting updates about his imaginary life and career. Maria Santos sends Christmas cards to a P.O. box she established in David's name, convinced that somehow, somewhere, he might receive them. "Most disturbing of all, Doctor." Rodriguez continues to include David in her prayers and still sets an extra place at her dinner table on holidays, explaining that just because someone exists only in our minds doesn't mean they're not real to us. The crew's shared psychosis had created a person so psychologically convincing that even after accepting his non-existence intellectually, they couldn't abandon him emotionally. Mission Control's final report on Mars Simulation 447 concluded that long-duration space missions pose a fundamental threat to human sanity, not through dramatic mental breakdowns, but through the gradual erosion of the boundary between reality and psychological necessity, where the human mind will literally create people to fill the emotional and practical voids that isolation creates, and once created, these phantom crew members become as real and important as actual human beings, proving that in the face of ultimate isolation, consciousness itself becomes the enemy, manufacturing comforting lies so convincing that even when exposed, the mind refuses to let them go. Terrifying truth. 6. The overview affects dark side. Let me tell you about Dr. Michael Torres, a man who saw Earth from space and came back convinced that human existence is a cosmic joke so meaningless that he abandoned his family, his career, and ultimately his humanity in pursuit of what he called the ultimate perspective. Torres was a mission specialist aboard the International Space Station for 6 months in 2018, a brilliant astrophysicist with 2 PhDs, and a reputation for finding wonder and meaning in the smallest details of scientific discovery. He launched as one of the most optimistic and life-affirming people NASA had ever sent to space, a man who spoke passionately about how space exploration would inspire humanity to greatness and solve our planetary problems through cosmic perspective. He returned as something else entirely, a hollow-eyed stranger who looked at his wife and children like they were interesting but ultimately irrelevant biological specimens, and who spent his first week back on Earth staring at the sky with an expression of such profound despair that his family was afraid to leave him alone. The transformation began during Torres's third week aboard the ISS when he experienced what NASA calls the overview effect, the cognitive shift that occurs when astronauts see Earth from space and gain a new perspective on humanity's place in the universe. Most astronauts describe this as a spiritual awakening, a profound sense of connection to all life on Earth, and a deep appreciation for our planet's beauty and fragility. For Torres, the experience was fundamentally different and infinitely more disturbing. "I was looking down at Earth during a night pass," Torres explained during his classified psychological debriefing, "and I could see the city lights spread across the continents like some kind of infection. All those lights represented millions of people living their little lives, fighting their little wars, loving their little loves, dying their little deaths, and from up there it looked so pointless, like bacteria in a petri dish, completely unaware that they're just biological processes happening on a rock floating in infinite darkness." What should have been a moment of cosmic connection became instead a revelation of cosmic insignificance that fundamentally altered Torres's perception of reality. As Torres spent more time observing Earth from orbit, his psychological state deteriorated in ways that NASA's medical team had never encountered before. He began referring to human civilization as the accident, and to individual human lives as temporary chemical reactions. His communications with his family became increasingly cold and clinical, as if he were observing them from an impossible distance, even while speaking directly to them. "How was Emma's soccer game?" his wife Sarah would ask during their weekly video calls, and Torres would respond with something like, "The juvenile human engaged in ritualized, physical competition with other juveniles, while adult humans observed and vocalized approval or disapproval based on arbitrary scoring systems. The statistical probability of this activity having any lasting significance approaches 0. Sarah later described these conversations as talking to someone who had been replaced by an alien anthropologist studying human behavior from the outside. Torres wasn't being cruel or dismissive. He genuinely seemed incapable of connecting emotionally with human concerns that he now viewed as cosmically irrelevant. The most disturbing aspect of Torres's transformation was how the overview effect had inverted his previous understanding of meaning and purpose. Where other astronauts found inspiration in Earth's fragility and beauty, Torres found only evidence of humanity's cosmic insignificance. "You see Earth from space, and you realize it's just a tiny blue dot in an infinite void," he explained to mission psychologists. "Every war that's ever been fought, every love story, every scientific discovery, every work of art, it all happened on this insignificant speck of dust that could be wiped out by an asteroid tomorrow, and the universe wouldn't even notice. We're not special. We're not chosen. We're not going anywhere. We're just complex chemical reactions that temporarily organize themselves into thinking patterns, and we've convinced ourselves that our thoughts and feelings matter when they objectively don't matter at all." Torres had developed what psychologists called cosmic nihilism, a worldview where the scale of the universe had rendered all human experience meaningless and absurd. When Torres returned to Earth after his 6-month mission, his family and colleagues were shocked by the extent of his psychological transformation. The man, who had left Earth full of wonder and curiosity, had returned as an emotionally disconnected observer who seemed incapable of caring about anything terrestrial. His marriage began falling apart immediately as Torres became unable to engage with his wife's concerns about their relationship, their children's needs, or their shared future. "Michael would look at me like I was a fascinating but ultimately unimportant specimen," Sarah Torres explained during couples therapy. When I'd try to discuss our problems, he'd say things like, "Why are you concerned about the temporary arrangement of two biological entities on a dying planet?" He wasn't trying to be hurtful. He genuinely couldn't understand why human relationships should matter in the context of cosmic time and space. It was like living with someone who had seen too much truth and couldn't unsee it. Torres's children reported feeling like their father was looking through them, rather than at them, as if they were transparent obstacles between him and some infinite distance only he could perceive. Torres's professional life disintegrated as completely as his personal relationships, but for different reasons, that revealed the true depth of his cosmic despair. He lost all interest in scientific research because he had become convinced that human knowledge was inherently limited and ultimately pointless. Why should I study the universe when I'm just a temporary arrangement of atoms that will be dead in a few decades and forgotten in a few centuries? Torres asked his department head when questioned about his declining performance. All of human science is just pattern recognition performed by biological computers that evolved to survive on one tiny planet. We're not discovering universal truths. We're just creating elaborate descriptions of our own sensory limitations. The universe doesn't care about our theories or our discoveries because we're not significant enough to matter. Torres began refusing research assignments, skipping conferences, and eventually stopped coming to work entirely, spending his days sitting in his backyard staring at the sky with what his neighbors described as the most hopeless expression I've ever seen on a human face. The final phase of Torres's psychological deterioration revealed the ultimate horror of the overview effect's dark side, the way cosmic perspective can destroy not just happiness and meaning, but the very capacity for human connection and emotion. Torres moved to a remote cabin in Alaska, cutting off all contact with his family and former colleagues, explaining in his final letter that human society had become unbearably trivial after seeing Earth from space. "I can't pretend that human concerns matter anymore," he wrote. "Every conversation feels like listening to bacteria discuss the importance of their metabolic processes. Every human emotion seems like a chemical reaction that's convinced itself it's significant. I've seen the bigger picture, and the bigger picture is that there is no picture, just an infinite void punctuated by brief, meaningless accidents of complexity. I need to be alone with this knowledge because I can't bear to watch other people live their lives as if they matter when I know they don't." Torres's isolation wasn't depression or misanthropy. It was the logical conclusion of having gained a perspective so vast that human existence appeared cosmically absurd. The most chilling aspect of Michael Torres's story is contained in the journals he left behind after his death from apparent suicide in 2023. 5 years after his return from space. The journals reveal a man who had spent years trying to find meaning in meaninglessness, purpose in purposelessness, connection in cosmic disconnection. "I keep trying to care about human things," one entry reads, "but it's like trying to get excited about the migration patterns of dust mites. I know intellectually that these things mattered to me before I saw Earth from space, but I can't remember why. The perspective from orbit doesn't go away. Every time I look at the sky, I remember how small and alone we really are, and everything, terrestrial, becomes transparent and trivial. I think the overview effect broke something in my brain that can't be fixed, the part that creates the illusion that human life has meaning. Now I can see through the illusion, and I can't unsee it. And I don't know how to live as a human being when I can no longer believe in human significance." Torres's final entry, written the day before his death, simply read, "The universe is vast and beautiful and completely indifferent to human suffering." I've been back on Earth for 5 years, but part of me never left orbit. I'm still up there, looking down at this tiny, fragile, meaningless world, unable to land, unable to care, unable to find my way back to the comfortable delusions that make human life bearable. The overview effect isn't enlightenment. It's a form of cosmic PTSD that shows you too much truth for the human mind to process. I wish I had never seen Earth from space, because now I can never unsee how alone we really are. Terrifying truth. Number 7. Isolation syndrome. Let me tell you about the Deep Space Habitat Test, a classified 18-month simulation that transformed 6 of NASA's most psychologically stable astronauts into paranoid enemies who came within hours of committing murder over imaginary crimes that existed only in their isolation-poisoned minds. The mission was designed to test crew dynamics during a Mars transit, confining 6 carefully selected astronauts in a habitat module barely larger than a 4-bedroom house, with no privacy, no escape, and no possibility of rescue if things went wrong. The crew was chosen specifically for their psychological compatibility. They had trained together for 3 years, considered each other close friends, and had passed every evaluation for emotional stability, conflict resolution, and stress management that NASA could devise. Mission commanders were confident that if any group could survive 18 months of complete isolation without psychological breakdown, it would be these 6 individuals. They were catastrophically wrong. The crew consisted of Commander Robert Hayes, a decorated astronaut with 15 years of exemplary service, mission specialist Lisa Park, a brilliant engineer and Hayes's closest friend, Dr. Michael Chen, the mission's physician and psychologist, flight engineer Sarah Rodriguez, an expert in life support systems, science officer David Kim, a geologist with expertise in planetary exploration, and communications specialist Jennifer Walsh, responsible for maintaining contact with mission control. For the first 3 months, everything proceeded exactly according to plan. The crew maintained their friendships, followed protocols perfectly, and showed no signs of the psychological stress that isolation studies predicted. Mission Control was beginning to believe they had finally cracked the code of long-duration space psychology. Then month 4 began, and with it the slow, inexorable transformation of 6 friends into 6 enemies trapped in a metal box with no escape. The breakdown began with something so trivial it would be laughable if it hadn't nearly led to murder. Lisa Park's conviction that Robert Hayes was stealing extra water rations. Park, who had been Hayes's closest friend and strongest supporter, became obsessed with the idea that Hayes was secretly taking more than his allotted share of recycled water, depriving the rest of the crew of resources they would need to survive. Security footage reviewed by Mission Control showed Hayes following water protocols exactly, never taking so much as an extra sip beyond his assigned ration. But Park's paranoia wasn't based on reality. It was the product of an isolation-damaged mind desperately searching for explanations for the growing sense of threat and competition that confined spaces create in human psychology. "I've been watching him," Park confided to Dr. Chen during what she thought was a private conversation. "Robert takes longer in the hygiene module than anyone else, and I can hear the water recycler running extra cycles when he's in there. He's killing us slowly, taking what we need to survive, and pretending to be our friend while he does it." What made Park's delusion so dangerous wasn't its irrationality, but how quickly it spread to the other crew members through what psychologists call contagion paranoia. Chen, initially skeptical of Park's accusations, began unconsciously monitoring Hayes's water usage and interpreting normal behavior as suspicious. When Hayes spent an extra few minutes in the hygiene module due to a minor equipment malfunction, Chen saw it as a confirmation of Park's theory. Rodriguez began timing Hayes's water breaks and reporting the data to Park, creating elaborate spreadsheets that proved Hayes was exceeding his rations by microscopic amounts that were actually within normal measurement error. Kim started avoiding Hayes during meals, convinced that Hayes was also taking extra food supplies. Walsh began monitoring communications to see if Hayes was secretly reporting their resource levels to Mission Control to cover up his theft. Within 2 weeks, 5 crew members had become convinced that their former friend and trusted commander was slowly murdering them through resource theft, despite the complete lack of any evidence beyond their shared paranoid delusions. The situation escalated beyond mere suspicion when the crew began actively sabotaging Hayes in what they believed was self-defense against his imaginary crimes. Park convinced the others that they needed to monitor Hayes more closely to gather evidence of his resource theft, leading to the installation of unauthorized surveillance equipment in the hygiene and food preparation areas. When Hayes discovered the cameras and questioned their purpose, the crew interpreted his reasonable objections as proof that he was hiding something. Chen began conducting unauthorized medical examinations on Hayes while he slept, looking for signs of dehydration that would prove he was taking extra water. Rodriguez started locking the water recycling systems when Hayes wasn't present, forcing him to request access and creating delays that she interpreted as evidence of his desperation for unauthorized resources. The crew had created a self-reinforcing cycle of paranoia where Hayes's normal reactions to their increasingly bizarre behavior were seen as confirmation of their original delusion. By month 16, the crew's paranoid obsession with Hayes had transformed into active planning for what they called protective action against his alleged sabotage. Park had convinced the others that Hayes was planning to kill them all by contaminating the life support systems and that they needed to restrain him before he could carry out his plan. Mission Control, monitoring the situation through encrypted communications channels, realized that 5 astronauts were seriously planning to overpower and potentially murder their commander based on completely fabricated evidence of crimes that existed only in their collective imagination. The crew had detailed discussions about how to restrain Hayes for everyone's safety, where to confine him in the habitat, and how to justify his restraint to Mission Control. They created shift schedules to ensure Hayes was never alone with critical systems, assigned themselves weapons made from maintenance tools, and established code words to signal when Hayes was acting suspiciously. 5 highly trained, previously rational individuals had become a conspiracy of potential murderers, united by shared delusions that felt more real to them than the objective evidence of their own surveillance systems. The crisis reached its breaking point when Hayes, completely unaware of the plot against him, volunteered for a routine maintenance task that required him to work alone in the life support module. The crew interpreted this as Hayes finally making his move to kill them all, and they prepared to ambush him when he emerged from the module. Park armed herself with a wrench, Chen prepared a sedative injection, and the others positioned themselves to overpower Hayes the moment he opened the module hatch. Only the intervention of Mission Control, who had been monitoring the crew's communications and realized the imminent danger, prevented what would have been the first murder in space simulation history. Mission Control immediately terminated the simulation and ordered emergency evacuation, but the crew resisted, insisting that Hayes needed to be neutralized before they could safely leave the habitat. It took 6 hours of negotiation and the intervention of armed security personnel to safely extract Hayes from a habitat where his 5 former friends had become convinced he was trying to kill them. The post-mission psychological evaluations revealed the true horror of isolation syndrome, how confinement with the same people inevitably breeds paranoia so complete that friendship transforms into murderous hatred based on completely imaginary offenses. None of the 5 crew members could explain why they had become convinced Hayes was trying to kill them, because their paranoid delusions had developed so gradually and seemed so logical at each step that they felt like rational responses to real threats. "I still think Robert was taking extra water," Park insisted during her debriefing, despite being shown definitive proof that Hayes had followed protocols exactly. "Maybe the evidence was tampered with, or maybe he was more careful than we thought, but I know what I observed. He was going to kill us all, and we were right to protect ourselves." The other crew members shared similar convictions, unable to accept that 18 months of confinement had transformed their perception of a trusted friend into a fantasy of betrayal and murder. Most disturbing of all, the 6 crew members could never work together again, because even after intensive psychological treatment, the paranoid associations formed during isolation remained stronger than their previous friendships. Hayes, despite being the victim of his crewmates' delusions, developed his own paranoid responses to enclosed spaces and could never again trust people he was confined with for extended periods. The Deep Space Habitat test proved that isolation doesn't just threaten individual sanity. It inevitably destroys the human capacity for trust and cooperation, transforming even the closest relationships into paranoid conspiracies where former friends become perceived enemies. And the only escape from the psychological torture of confinement is the elimination of the people trapped with you, making long-duration space missions not just dangerous to individual crew members, but fundamentally incompatible with human social psychology. Terrifying Truth 8. The Communication Lag Terror. Let me tell you about Dr. Janet Rivers, a mission specialist who experienced a medical emergency on a Mars simulation that revealed the psychological horror of being 22 minutes away from any possible help, where every desperate plea for assistance echoes back from Earth too late to matter, and where you must watch yourself die in slow motion while expert medical advice arrives just in time to confirm that you're already beyond saving. Rivers was participating in the most realistic Mars communication delay simulation ever conducted, where all contact with Earth was artificially delayed by 44 minutes to replicate the round-trip communication time between Mars and Earth at maximum orbital separation. The simulation was designed to test how crews would handle routine problems when expert assistance was nearly an hour away, but no one had prepared for what would happen when routine problems became life-or-death emergencies in the communication void between worlds. Rivers was 3 months into the simulation when she began experiencing what initially seemed like routine digestive discomfort during her evening meal. As the Habitat's medical officer, she ran a self-diagnosis using the onboard medical systems and determined that she was likely experiencing minor food poisoning or stomach flu. Unpleasant but not dangerous conditions that could be easily managed with rest and medication. Following standard protocol, she radioed her condition to Earth's medical team for confirmation and guidance, not realizing that she had just begun a 44-minute countdown to potentially catastrophic medical misinformation. Mission Control, this is Dr. Rivers, reporting minor gastrointestinal distress, possible food contamination. Requesting confirmation of treatment protocol, she transmitted to Earth, expecting routine acknowledgement and standard treatment recommendations. What she received instead was 22 minutes of escalating agony, followed by medical advice that was already 12 minutes obsolete by the time she heard it. As Rivers waited for Earth's response, her condition rapidly deteriorated in ways that transformed her self-diagnosis from minor illness to life-threatening emergency. The abdominal pain intensified and localized to her lower right side, accompanied by nausea, vomiting, and a low-grade fever that spiked rapidly. Rivers, with her medical training, began to suspect appendicitis, but she couldn't be certain without Earth's confirmation and guidance. The psychological torture of the communication delay became apparent as Rivers experienced what she described as dying in real time, while help existed in the past tense. She knew that expert physicians on Earth possessed the knowledge to save her life, but that knowledge was locked away behind an insurmountable wall of time and space. I'm alone on Mars with a potentially fatal condition. Rivers radioed to Earth in growing desperation. And by the time you hear this message and respond, I might already be dead from something you could have easily treated if I were on Earth. The communication delay created a psychological nightmare where Rivers had to make life or death medical decisions based on outdated information, while her condition changed faster than Earth could respond. When Earth's first response finally arrived, standard recommendations for food poisoning that were now completely irrelevant to her worsening symptoms, Rivers faced the terrifying realization that she was essentially treating herself with medical advice from the past. "The pain has moved to my right side and intensified," she radioed back to Earth. "I think this might be appendicitis, not food poisoning. Should I prepare for surgery? Should I take antibiotics? Please respond immediately." But she knew that her desperate plea for immediate help would take 22 minutes to reach Earth, and their response would take another 22 minutes to return, during which her condition could progress from treatable to fatal. Rivers spent the next several hours trapped in what she called medical purgatory, receiving treatment recommendations that were always at least 44 minutes behind her actual condition. When Earth finally acknowledged the possibility of appendicitis and recommended specific medications and monitoring protocols, Rivers' symptoms had already progressed beyond their recommendations. Her fever had spiked dangerously high, her pain had become excruciating, and she was showing signs of internal bleeding that Earth wouldn't know about for another 22 minutes. "I'm following your protocols from an hour ago," Rivers reported through tears of pain and frustration. "But my condition now is completely different from what you're treating. I feel like I'm receiving medical advice from ghosts, from doctors who are treating a version of me that existed in the past, while the real me is dying alone in real time." The psychological horror intensified when Rivers realized that she might need emergency surgery, but Earth's surgical guidance would be meaningless given the communication delay. The habitat was equipped with a robotic surgical system designed for remote operation by Earth-based surgeons. But the 44-minute delay made real-time surgical guidance impossible. Rivers would have to perform surgery on herself using pre-recorded instructions and hope that her condition matched whatever scenario the Earth doctors were preparing for. "I'm looking at surgical instruments right now," Rivers radioed to Earth in desperation. "And I know that if I need surgery, I'll have to cut into my own abdomen following instructions you gave me for a medical situation that might not even exist anymore by the time your guidance reaches me. I could kill myself trying to save myself because your advice will always be for the wrong patient, the patient I was nearly an hour ago." The crisis reached its peak when Rivers' appendix ruptured, creating a medical emergency that required immediate surgical intervention to prevent fatal sepsis. She radioed this development to Earth, knowing that by the time they received her message and could provide surgical guidance, she would likely be dead from infection or have to perform the surgery herself without any real-time support. "My appendix has burst," she transmitted in what she believed might be her final message. "I can feel the infection spreading through my abdomen. In 22 minutes, you'll hear me say these words, and in 44 minutes, I'll receive your response telling me what I should have done 22 minutes ago to save my life. I'm going to attempt surgery on myself now, following the general protocols in the medical database, because waiting for your guidance means certain death." Rivers spent the next hour performing emergency surgery on herself using robotic instruments while following pre-recorded instructional videos, completely cut off from real-time medical expertise, knowing that if she made a single mistake, she would die alone while expert help existed in an unreachable past. The simulation was terminated when Rivers successfully removed her ruptured appendix and stabilized her condition, but the psychological trauma of the experience fundamentally changed how she viewed space exploration and human survival beyond Earth. Rivers described the communication delay as the loneliest terror imaginable, being surrounded by expert knowledge and support that existed in the wrong moment in time, like being saved by rescuers who arrived just early enough to watch you die. The communication delay doesn't just delay help, Rivers explained during her psychological evaluation. It creates a temporal prison where you're trapped in the present while all assistance exists in the past and future but never in the now when you need it. You know that expert medical advice exists, that skilled surgeons are ready to help, that life-saving knowledge is available, but it's all locked away behind time itself. It's like drowning while watching lifeguards on shore who were trying to save someone who fell in the water 44 minutes ago. Rivers never participated in another Mars simulation because she became convinced that the communication delay represented a form of isolation so complete that it fundamentally violated human social cooperation. The idea that help should be available when needed, that expertise can be shared in real time, that medical emergencies can be managed through consultation with experts. On Mars, Rivers realized, astronauts wouldn't just be alone in space, they would be alone in time, cut off from the accumulated medical knowledge of humanity by the cruel mathematics of orbital mechanics and the speed of light, forced to face death and disease with only their own limited knowledge, while knowing that vast medical expertise exists in an unreachable temporal distance, making Mars not just a hostile physical environment, but a temporal prison where help is always coming but never arrives in time to matter. Terrifying truth. 9. Invisible radiation poisoning. Let me tell you about Captain David Reeves, a man who returned from space apparently healthy and triumphant, only to discover that he had been slowly murdered by an invisible enemy that had been attacking his DNA for 14 months while he felt perfectly fine, and whose death became a nightmare of cellular destruction that no earthbound medicine could understand or treat. Reeves was the commander of Deep Space Mission Artemis 7, a 14-month journey to the outer edges of Earth's magnetosphere, designed to test human endurance in the deep radiation environment that astronauts would face during Mars missions. He was chosen for his exceptional physical condition, his perfect health record, and his body's demonstrated resistance to the lower levels of radiation encountered during previous space flights. Mission planners were confident that Reeves could handle the increased radiation exposure of deep space, and his daily health reports throughout the mission showed no signs of radiation sickness, fatigue, or cellular damage. Reeves returned to Earth feeling better than ever, passing every medical examination with flying colors, and was celebrated as proof that humans could survive long-duration deep space missions. The celebration lasted exactly 6 months. The first sign that something was catastrophically wrong came when Reeves began experiencing what he described as exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. A bone-deep fatigue that seemed to emanate from inside his cells rather than from physical exertion or mental stress. His doctors initially attributed this to readjustment stress from returning to Earth's gravity and the psychological challenges of transitioning back to terrestrial life. Reeves underwent extensive medical testing, but every examination showed normal results. His blood work was perfect, his organ function was excellent. His cardiovascular system was stronger than most men half his age. Yet Reeves felt like he was slowly dying from the inside out, as if some fundamental process of life was shutting down at a molecular level that medical instruments couldn't detect. "I feel like my cells are forgetting how to be alive," Reeves described to his physicians with growing desperation. "It's not pain, exactly, and it's not sickness like I've ever experienced. It's like my body is running down like a battery that can't hold a charge anymore." As Reeves's condition worsened, he developed symptoms that baffled his medical team because they didn't follow any known pattern of terrestrial disease. His hair began falling out in patches, but not the uniform hair loss associated with chemotherapy or radiation sickness. His skin developed a strange, translucent quality, becoming thin and fragile in some areas while remaining normal in others. Most disturbing of all, Reeves began experiencing what he called cellular memories, vivid flashbacks to moments during his space mission, but from the perspective of his individual cells rather than his consciousness. "I can remember my DNA being hit by cosmic rays," Reeves explained to increasingly concerned physicians. "I have memories of protons punching holes through my chromosomes, of my cells trying to repair damage faster than it was happening. It's like my body recorded every moment of radiation exposure, and now those memories are playing back as my cells start to fail." Medical experts dismissed these cellular memories as psychological manifestations of stress, but Reeves insisted they felt more real and immediate than his normal memories of the mission. The truth about Reeves's condition became apparent when advanced genetic testing revealed something that fundamentally challenged medical understanding of radiation exposure and cellular damage. The cosmic radiation Reeves had been exposed to during his 14 months in deep space had caused a unique form of DNA damage that didn't manifest immediately like conventional radiation poisoning. Instead, the high-energy cosmic rays had created delayed-action genetic damage, essentially time bombs built into his cellular structure that were now detonating months after the original exposure. His cells were failing, not because they had been immediately destroyed by radiation, but because the radiation had altered their genetic programming in ways that caused them to self-destruct on a preset timeline. "It's like the cosmic rays installed suicide programs in my DNA," Reeves explained with horrifying clarity during his final interviews. "My cells functioned normally for months after the damage occurred, but they were programmed to die, and now the program is executing exactly as the radiation designed it to." What made Reeves' condition so psychologically devastating wasn't just the physical deterioration, but the way it revealed the true nature of cosmic radiation as an intelligent-seeming enemy that attacks human life on a timeline beyond human comprehension. The cosmic rays hadn't killed Reeves immediately. They had infected him with a form of delayed death that allowed him to return to Earth healthy and happy, only to begin dying months later from damage that had been invisibly accumulating during every moment of his deep space mission. Reeves developed a form of leukemia unlike anything oncologists had ever encountered, with cancer cells that seemed to be following genetic instructions written by cosmic radiation rather than normal cellular mutation patterns. "The doctors keep saying I have cancer," Reeves explained during his deteriorating health. "But this doesn't feel like cancer. It feels like my body is following orders that were given to it by something alien, something that understood human biology well enough to program my death with surgical precision." The final months of Reeves's life became a nightmare of cellular rebellion, as different organ systems began failing according to the radiation-programmed timeline built into his damaged DNA. His immune system collapsed first, leaving him vulnerable to infections that his body no longer recognized as threats. His bone marrow stopped producing healthy blood cells, replacing them with malformed cellular structures that looked more like alien tissue than human biology. Most horrifying of all, Reeves remained mentally clear throughout his physical deterioration, able to observe and describe the systematic destruction of his body from the inside. "I can feel my cells dying in waves," Reeves reported during his final weeks. "It's like my body is being deconstructed according to some cosmic blueprint for human destruction. The radiation didn't just damage me randomly. It studied my biology during those 14 months in space and designed a customized death specifically for my cellular structure. Reeves's death, when it finally came, provided the most chilling evidence of cosmic radiation's alien intelligence and long-term planning. His final medical records showed that his cellular failure had followed a precise pattern that maximized psychological horror, while ensuring that his death would be slow enough for medical study but inevitable enough to prevent any hope of treatment. The cosmic radiation had essentially performed a 14-month vivisection of Reeves's genetics, learning how his body functioned and then designing a cellular collapse sequence that would unfold months later with mathematical precision. David didn't die of radiation poisoning in any conventional sense, his lead oncologist explained during the classified medical review. He died of radiation programming. His cells had been reprogrammed by cosmic rays to execute a delayed death sequence that was more sophisticated and targeted than anything human medicine has ever encountered. It's as if the radiation was conscious, studying him during his mission and designing a customized form of cellular murder that would activate long after he thought he was safe. The most terrifying aspect of David Reeves's story lies in what it reveals about the true nature of deep space travel and cosmic radiation exposure. Every astronaut on long-duration missions beyond Earth's magnetic field is essentially volunteering to be infected with delayed-action genetic time bombs that may not activate for months or years after their return. The cosmic radiation doesn't just damage human tissue, it studies it, learns from it, and programs personalized death sequences into DNA with an intelligence that suggests the universe itself is actively hostile to human expansion beyond Earth. Reeves's case proved that space doesn't just try to kill astronauts during their missions. It infects them with invisible death that follows them home, turning their own cells into sleeper agents programmed to destroy them long after they believe they've survived the dangers of space. Current radiation shielding can only block 30% of cosmic radiation, meaning that every deep space astronaut is guaranteed to return to Earth carrying genetic damage designed by an alien intelligence that understands human biology well enough to craft personalized cellular destruction sequences, making long-duration space travel not just dangerous but a form of delayed suicide where the universe itself becomes the assassin, killing astronauts with their own reprogrammed DNA months or years after they thought they had safely returned home. Terrifying truth. 10. Micrometeorite. Roulette. Let me tell you about the experimental satellite Probe X7 and astronaut commander Lisa Martinez, whose encounter with a grain of cosmic sand traveling at 17,000 miles per hour revealed that space is filled with invisible bullets that can kill you faster than you can blink, and that every moment spent outside a spacecraft is essentially playing Russian roulette with the universe itself as the trigger finger. Probe X-7 was a cutting-edge atmospheric research satellite that cost $400 million and represented 2 years of the world's most advanced engineering, designed to study Mars's upper atmosphere in preparation for human missions. The satellite was equipped with the most sophisticated micrometeorite shielding ever developed, layers of specialized materials that could theoretically withstand impacts from space debris traveling at hypersonic speeds. The satellite was launched with great fanfare, expected to operate for 5 years and revolutionize our understanding of planetary atmospheres. It lasted exactly 17 days before being completely destroyed by a piece of space debris smaller than a grain of rice. The destruction happened so quickly that ground-based tracking systems couldn't even record the impact. One moment, Probe X7 was transmitting perfect data, and the next moment it was an expanding cloud of metallic debris tumbling through space. The impacting object was later calculated to be no larger than a paint flake, possibly a fragment of metal shed from a spacecraft decades earlier, traveling at 17,500 miles per hour relative to the satellite's position. At that velocity, the tiny fragment carried more kinetic energy than a hand grenade, and when it struck Probe X7's main hull, it didn't just penetrate the satellite, it vaporized it. The impact lasted exactly 0.003 seconds, faster than human reflexes, faster than any warning system, faster than the speed of thought itself. $400 million of human engineering and scientific ambition was reduced to glittering space junk by a piece of debris so small it would have been invisible to the naked eye, and so fast that it existed in one location for mere microseconds before continuing its eternal journey through the solar system. Commander Martinez learned about the true horror of micrometeorite impacts during EVA mission 447, when she became the first human being to witness the death of a fellow astronaut from cosmic debris impact. Martinez was working alongside flight engineer Tom Bradley on routine maintenance of the International Space Station's solar arrays when the universe decided to demonstrate the lethal randomness of space debris. Bradley was approximately 20 meters away from Martinez, clearly visible in her peripheral vision, when what appeared to be a tiny flash of light passed between them. Martinez initially thought she had seen a reflection from Bradley's helmet or a glint of sunlight off the station's equipment. Then she noticed that Bradley had stopped moving, floating motionless in his work position with his arms still extended toward the solar panel he had been adjusting. "Tom, do you copy?" Martinez called over the comm system, receiving only silence in response. When she maneuvered closer to check on her crewmate, she discovered something that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. Bradley's helmet visor had been penetrated by a perfectly round hole, no larger than a pencil tip, so small and clean that Martinez initially thought it was a design feature she had never noticed before. The micrometeorite had punched through the visor's multiple layers of protective material as if they were tissue paper, continued through Bradley's helmet, skull, and brain, exited through the back of his helmet, and continued into space without slowing down perceptibly. The entire transit through Bradley's head had taken less than a millisecond, faster than nerve impulses, faster than pain receptors, faster than consciousness itself. Bradley had been killed so quickly that his body hadn't even had time to register the impact. He died instantly and peacefully, still reaching for the solar panel, completely unaware that a grain of cosmic sand had just erased his existence. "He looked like he was still working," Martinez reported to Mission Control, in a voice hollow with shock. "His body position was perfect. His hands were still positioned exactly right for the task he was performing. If it wasn't for the tiny hole in his visor, I would have thought he was just concentrating really hard on his work." The psychological horror of Bradley's death wasn't just the randomness of the impact, but the way it revealed the absolute helplessness of human beings in the face of cosmic debris. The micrometeorite that killed Bradley had been traveling through space for potentially millions of years, following a trajectory determined by gravitational interactions between planets, asteroids, and comets that occurred before human civilization existed. Its path had been set in motion by cosmic forces operating on scales of space and time beyond human comprehension. And Bradley had simply been in the wrong place at exactly the wrong microsecond when billions of years of celestial mechanics converged on the location of his head. Tom was killed by ancient history, Martinez explained during her psychological debriefing. That piece of debris was probably older than life on Earth, following a path through space that was determined before the solar system even formed. Tom just happened to intersect with billions of years of cosmic destiny, and he was erased from existence in less time than it takes light to travel from his helmet to mine. The most terrifying aspect of Bradley's death was how it revealed the true nature of EVA operations as a form of cosmic gambling, where the stakes are instant annihilation and the odds are unknowable. Every second spent, Outside a spacecraft, astronauts are exposed to millions of pieces of space debris, ranging in size from molecular dust to boulder-sized chunks of defunct satellites, all traveling at velocities that turn even microscopic fragments into hypersonic bullets. The debris is invisible, untrackable, and absolutely unavoidable. If a piece of space junk has your name on it, you'll never see it coming, and you'll never know what hit you. Martinez developed what psychologists called hypervigilance paranoia, constantly scanning space around her for threats that she knew she could never see or avoid. Every time I go outside now, I'm aware that I might have already been killed and just don't know it yet, Martinez explained. These micrometeorites travel faster than sound, faster than light can reach your eyes, faster than your brain can process information. I could be dead right now, and my consciousness just hasn't caught up with my body yet. Martinez's final EVA mission became a nightmare of anticipatory terror, as she spent 4 hours outside the station convinced that every moment might be her last. Not because of equipment failure or human error, but because the universe might randomly select her for instantaneous annihilation by invisible cosmic debris. She described the experience as trying to work while playing Russian roulette with a gun that has millions of chambers and might fire at any time, moment, where concentration on tasks became impossible because of the constant awareness that death could arrive literally faster than thought. I kept stopping work to look around, even though I knew that looking around was pointless, Martinez reported. If debris is heading for me, I'll never see it coming. If it's small enough to kill me, it's too small to see. If it's fast enough to reach me, it's too fast to avoid. I'm essentially working in a cosmic shooting gallery where I'm the target, and the bullets are invisible, and I'll never hear the shot that kills me. Martinez refused all future EVA assignments, and eventually left the astronaut program because she became convinced that spending time in open space was volunteering for execution by cosmic lottery, where survival depended entirely on luck rather than training, equipment, or skill. The final horror of micrometeorite roulette lies in what it reveals about the fundamental nature of space as an environment actively hostile to human survival. Every piece of space debris, from flakes of paint to fragments of destroyed satellites, becomes a hypersonic projectile capable of instant lethality, and the amount of debris in Earth orbit is increasing exponentially as more satellites are launched and more collisions create additional fragments. Martinez's post-mission analysis concluded that EVA operations are becoming increasingly dangerous, not because of equipment failures or human error, but because space itself is filling up with invisible bullets traveling at impossible speeds. Space isn't just empty, vacuum trying to kill us, Martinez explained in her final report. It's an active shooting gallery where we're the targets, and the ammunition is everything humanity has ever launched that broke apart or got destroyed. We're being shot at by our own space junk, by natural cosmic debris, by fragments of asteroids and comets, all traveling fast enough to vaporize human tissue on contact. Every EVA is essentially a death wish, where we hope the universe doesn't randomly select us for instantaneous annihilation by cosmic debris we'll never see coming until it's already killed us. The truth about micrometeorite roulette is that space exploration isn't just dangerous. It's a form of cosmic gambling where the house always wins eventually, and the only question is whether you'll be killed by a fragment of human space junk or by a piece of natural cosmic debris that's been traveling through the void since before Earth formed, making every moment in space a countdown to potential instant death by invisible bullets fired by the universe itself. Terrifying truth. 11. Solar Storm Apocalypse. Let me tell you about the solar storm crisis of March 13, 2012, when the sun nearly murdered 6 astronauts aboard the International Space Station with a burst of invisible death that traveled 93 million miles in 8 minutes and 20 seconds, and how astronauts Commander Patricia Vance and flight engineer Alex Chen came within 7 minutes of being cooked alive by radiation levels that would have killed them faster than a microwave oven kills bacteria. The crisis began at 1447 GMT, when solar observation satellites detected what NASA euphemistically calls a major solar particle event, a massive explosion on the sun's surface that hurled billions of tons of superheated plasma and high-energy protons directly toward Earth at nearly the speed of light. The solar flare was classified as an X 9.3 event, the second highest rating on the solar activity scale, carrying enough radiation to kill unprotected humans in minutes and disable electronic systems across entire continents. What made this particular solar storm so terrifying wasn't its size. Larger flares had been recorded before, but its timing, occurring while 2 astronauts were in the middle of a routine EVA with no possibility of reaching shelter before the radiation arrived. Commander Vance and flight engineer Chen were 43 minutes into what should have been a routine 3-hour spacewalk to replace a faulty communications array when Mission Control's voice crackled through their comm systems with barely controlled panic. ISS, this is Houston. We have an emergency. Major solar particle event detected. Radiation arrival in approximately 11 minutes. Abort EVA immediately and get to the shielded compartment now. The words hit Vance and Chen like a physical blow because they both understood the implications instantly. They were floating in the vacuum of space wearing suits that provided absolutely zero protection against high-energy solar radiation, and they had 11 minutes to complete a return journey that normally took 25 minutes. The sun had essentially fired a weapon at them that would arrive faster than they could possibly escape, and their only hope was to reach the station's radiation shelter before being cooked alive by invisible death from 93 million miles away. What followed was the most desperate race against time and space exploration history, as Vance and Chen abandoned all safety protocols and pushed their equipment beyond design limits in a frantic attempt to reach shelter before the solar radiation turned their bodies into biological waste. "We're moving as fast as possible," Vance reported through labored breathing as she and Chen used their suit thrusters at maximum output, burning through fuel reserves that were supposed to last the entire EVA. ETA to airlock approximately 18 minutes, but we're showing solar particle arrival in 8 minutes. Houston, we're not going to make it. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. The solar storm was traveling at 300 million meters per second, while Vance and Chen were moving at roughly 3 meters per second, making their desperate rush to safety about as effective as trying to outrun a bullet by walking slightly faster. They were racing against the speed of light itself, and the speed of light was winning. Mission Control's increasingly frantic updates revealed the true scope of the solar apocalypse bearing down on the astronauts. Radiation levels are projected at 5,000 times normal background, Houston reported. Exposure time to lethal dose is estimated at 12 to 15 minutes for unprotected personnel. Vance and Chen both understood what those numbers meant. If the solar storm reached them before they could get inside the station, they would receive enough radiation in the first few minutes to guarantee death from acute radiation syndrome within days, and enough radiation within an hour to kill them outright through immediate cellular destruction. The solar storm wasn't just dangerous, it was carrying enough high-energy particles to literally cook human tissue from the inside out, turning blood into plasma and bones into radioactive ash. "We're essentially about to be microwaved by the sun," Chen reported with grim accuracy. "If we don't reach the shelter in the next 6 minutes, we're going to die very slowly and very painfully from radiation poisoning." The psychological horror of the situation became apparent as Vance and Chen realized they might have to choose between certain death from solar radiation and probable death from equipment failure. Their desperate rush to the airlock was consuming fuel and oxygen at rates far beyond safety margins, and their life support systems were beginning to show critical warnings as they pushed everything beyond design specifications. "We're burning through our reserves," Vance reported. "If we don't die from radiation in the next 5 minutes, we might suffocate before we can get inside." They were caught between two forms of death: the immediate threat of solar radiation that would cook them alive in minutes, and the slower threat of a life support failure that would suffocate them in their suits while they floated helplessly outside the station. Chen began showing signs of hyperventilation as the psychological stress of choosing between different methods of dying overwhelmed his training and experience. "I can't breathe," Chen reported through increasingly panicked gasps. "The radiation is coming, and I can't breathe, and we're never going to make it, and I'm going to die out here in the vacuum while the sun kills me with invisible fire." The crisis reached its peak when solar radiation began arriving exactly as predicted, but in a form that neither Vance nor Chen had expected. They could actually see it. High-energy solar particles began interacting with their helmet visors and suit materials, creating tiny flashes of light that looked like camera flashes going off inside their helmets. "I'm seeing lights," Vance reported with growing terror. "Bright flashes in my peripheral vision, like lightning inside my helmet. Houston, is that the radiation? Can I actually see the radiation that's killing me?" Mission Control confirmed their worst fears. The flashes were Cherenkov radiation, high-energy particles traveling faster than light through the materials of their helmets, creating visible light as they passed through the astronauts' visual field and brain tissue. Vance and Chen were literally watching their own execution as solar particles punched through their bodies, creating light shows inside their skulls while delivering potentially lethal doses of radiation directly to their nervous systems. Vance and Chen reached the station's airlock with less than 2 minutes to spare, but their ordeal was far from over because the airlock cycle required 4 minutes to complete, and they were already being irradiated by the leading edge of the solar storm. They had to wait inside the airlock while high-energy particles continued bombarding their bodies, watching the radiation counters climb to levels that guaranteed at least some cellular damage and possible long-term health consequences. "We made it to the airlock," Vance reported, "but we're still being cooked alive in here while we wait for pressurization. I can still see the flashes in my vision and the radiation alarms are going insane. We're going to survive this, but we're going to pay for it for the rest of our lives." The final 4 minutes inside the airlock became a nightmare of anticipation as both astronauts waited to discover how much radiation damage they had sustained and whether their desperate race against the sun had saved their lives or merely delayed their deaths. The aftermath of the solar storm crisis revealed the ultimate truth about humanity's vulnerability to solar radiation: that the sun can kill astronauts anywhere in the solar system with just 8 minutes warning, and that current spacecraft shielding is essentially useless against major solar particle events. Vance and Chen both survived their radiation exposure, but medical examinations revealed significant cellular damage that would increase their cancer risk for the rest of their lives. More psychologically devastating was their newfound awareness that the sun, the source of all life on Earth, could randomly decide to murder them with invisible death at any moment, turning every EVA into a gamble against solar weather patterns beyond human prediction or control. "I used to love looking at the sun during EVAs," Vance explained during her post-mission debriefing. "It was beautiful, this perfect golden disk that gave life to everything on Earth. Now I'm terrified of it. I know that it's constantly trying to kill me with radiation I can't see or feel until it's too late. The sun isn't our friend in space, it's a nuclear weapon pointed at every astronaut who ventures beyond Earth's magnetic field, and it fires randomly without warning. The solar storm crisis proved that space exploration isn't just about overcoming the vacuum and cold of space. It's about surviving in a cosmic shooting gallery where the sun itself becomes the enemy, capable of delivering lethal radiation doses anywhere in the solar system with the speed of light, making every moment spent beyond Earth's protective magnetosphere a countdown to potential solar execution that could begin without warning and arrive faster than any possible escape, transforming the life-giving star into humanity's greatest threat in the endless war between human ambition and cosmic hostility. Terrifying truth. 12. The Kessler effect. Let me tell you about the cascade event of February 11, 2009, when two satellites collided in orbit and created a chain reaction of destruction that is slowly but inevitably transforming space around Earth into an impenetrable shell of hypersonic death, trapping humanity on our planet for potentially the next 400 years. The collision occurred 790 kilometers above Siberia, when the defunct Russian military satellite Cosmos 2251, tumbling dead through space for over a decade, intersected the orbital path of the operational American communications satellite Iridium 33 at a relative velocity of 42,120 kilometers per hour. The impact lasted exactly 0.006 seconds and released the kinetic energy equivalent of 2 tons of TNT, instantly vaporizing both satellites and creating over 2,300 pieces of trackable debris larger than 10 centimeters, plus an estimated 300,000 smaller fragments that are invisible to ground-based tracking, but capable of destroying any spacecraft they encounter. What makes this collision so terrifying isn't the immediate destruction it caused, but what it represents, the beginning of a cascading chain reaction that could make space exploration impossible for centuries. The Kessler effect, named after NASA scientist Donald Kessler, who predicted this nightmare scenario in 1978, works like cosmic dominoes falling in slow motion across the entire orbital environment around Earth. Each collision creates thousands of new pieces of debris traveling at hypersonic speeds, and each piece of debris has the potential to cause additional collisions that create even more debris, leading to an exponential increase in space junk that eventually reaches critical mass where collisions become self-sustaining and unstoppable. The 2009 collision was the first documented case of the Kessler effect beginning in real time, as tracking systems immediately detected dozens of secondary impacts as the original debris cloud spread across multiple orbital planes, destroying or damaging additional satellites and creating even more fragments. Mission Control watched in helpless horror as what started as a single collision began spawning additional collisions at an accelerating rate, like watching a cosmic cancer metastasize through Earth's orbital environment. What makes the Kessler effect so psychologically devastating is the timeline. It's not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow-motion apocalypse that unfolds over decades, making space gradually more dangerous until it becomes completely inaccessible to human exploration. Dr. Sarah Chen, NASA's leading orbital debris specialist, described tracking the cascade as watching humanity's future in space being erased one collision at a time. Each new collision adds to the growing shell of hypersonic shrapnel surrounding Earth. And once begun, the cascade becomes mathematically inevitable because there's no way to clean up debris that's traveling at bullet speeds across thousands of cubic kilometers of space. We're watching our own space junk turn against us, Chen explained during classified briefings about the cascade's progression. Every satellite we've ever launched, every rocket stage we've abandoned, every piece of equipment that's broken apart in orbit, it's all becoming ammunition in a war against our own ability to leave Earth. We created this debris field over decades of space exploration, and now It's going to take centuries to clear itself through atmospheric decay. The true horror of the Kessler effect became apparent to astronauts aboard the International Space Station, who found themselves trapped in an increasingly dangerous environment where space debris posed a constant threat of instant death. Commander Michael Torres reported that the station had performed 32 emergency debris avoidance maneuvers since the 2009 collision, each one a desperate attempt to avoid being destroyed by fragments traveling at 17,000 miles per hour. Every few weeks, we get a call from Mission Control telling us that a piece of debris is heading our way, and we have minutes to fire our thrusters and move the entire station out of the way, Torres explained. We're essentially playing dodgeball with invisible bullets, and if we miss one, if the calculations are wrong by even a few meters, 6 people die, instantly, and the station becomes part of the debris field that's trying to kill future astronauts. The psychological stress of living under constant threat of instantaneous destruction by space junk created what Torres called orbital paranoia, where every small sound or vibration could be the beginning of a collision that would kill everyone aboard. The most terrifying aspect of the Kessler cascade is how it reveals the self-destructive nature of human space exploration. The more successfully we explore space, the more we contaminate it with debris that eventually makes space exploration impossible. Each successful mission leaves behind fragments that become threats to future missions, creating a feedback loop where space exploration ultimately destroys the ability to explore space. Dr. Martinez, a mission planner for Mars exploration programs, described the psychological impact of realizing that humanity might have already locked itself out of space forever. We spent the entire history of spaceflight dreaming about exploring the solar system, colonizing other planets, spreading humanity across the stars. But it turns out that the act of leaving Earth creates the conditions that prevent us from ever leaving Earth again. We've been building our own prison one launch at a time, surrounding our planet with a shell of hypersonic death that could trap us here for centuries. The Kessler effect transforms space exploration from humanity's greatest adventure into humanity's greatest mistake. The cascade's progression has created what orbital mechanics experts call exclusion zones, regions of space so densely packed with debris that sending spacecraft through them is essentially guaranteed suicide. Low Earth orbit, where most human space activity occurs, is becoming increasingly inaccessible as debris densities approach critical thresholds where any spacecraft has a high probability of being destroyed within hours or days of launch. We're one major collision away from losing access to space completely, warned Dr. Chen during her final briefing before the program was classified. If 2 large objects collide in the wrong orbit at the wrong angle, they could create enough debris to trigger a runaway cascade that makes low Earth orbit uninhabitable for spacecraft. The International Space Station would become a death trap. Satellite communications would fail globally, and launching new missions would be like flying through a cosmic blender. The mathematics of orbital debris suggest that this critical collision is not a possibility but an inevitability, transforming every day the cascade continues into a countdown toward complete orbital inaccessibility. The final horror of the Kessler effect lies in its permanence. Once the cascade reaches critical mass, it becomes self-sustaining for centuries, trapping humanity on Earth while the debris field slowly decays through atmospheric drag over periods measured in human lifetimes. Children born today might live their entire lives unable to travel to space because previous generations filled Earth's orbital environment with hypersonic shrapnel. The dreams of Mars colonies, lunar bases, and interstellar exploration could all be ended not by technological limitations or lack of funding, but by humanity's own space junk turning the cosmos into an inaccessible shooting gallery. Dr. Rodriguez, who has spent her career planning human missions to Mars, described the psychological impact of the Kessler effect as cosmic claustrophobia on a species level. "We used to look up at the stars and see infinite possibilities," Rodriguez explained. "Now, we look up and see a prison we built for ourselves, a shell of our own debris that could keep humanity trapped on Earth for longer than we've had civilization. We wanted to reach the stars, but instead we surrounded ourselves with the fragments of our own ambitions, creating a cosmic barrier that turns space exploration from humanity's destiny into humanity's impossibility. The universe didn't trap us on Earth. We trapped ourselves, one failed satellite at a time, building a wall of hypersonic death that could keep us grounded for centuries, while the cosmos remains forever just beyond our reach."